Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multidimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 164 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker, and on this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 25 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. I've got a great show for you today. I return to my exploration of the Dungeon Master's Guide with a discussion on creating a campaign. Whether you're creating your first campaign or you've created so many that you've lost count, the DMG has some tools to help you. But before we crack open our DMGs today, I have a couple announcements I want to make and also some feedback I want to talk about from previous episodes. So the first big announcement, and I'm really excited to make this announcement today. If you have ever wished that you could get a Game Master's Journey t-shirt or sweatshirt or coffee mug or anything like that, this is your day, because we have opened a store over on Spreadshirt. And Nikki worked very hard over the last few weeks coming up with quite a few designs for you to choose from. There are designs for Game Master's Journey featuring our logo and various album arts we've had through the history of the show. There are designs for the Trickster's Labyrinth, my D&D adventure, and there are also some additional designs just for fun. And the way this website works is you pick the design that you want. You pick the thing that you want it on, whether that's a t-shirt or a sweatshirt or an apron or a coffee mug or whatever you want. And it's kind of self-service. So you can put pretty much any design on any product that they have there on the site. And you can support Star Walker Studios and Game Master's Journey and sport the latest summer fashions of nerdwear and geek accoutrement by shopping at our store. So I will have a link to our store on Spreadshirt, if I could speak straight, in the show notes for this episode over at starwalkerstudios.com. And also there you can grab a coupon code. It's only good for the first 14 days. The store opened, opened July 9th, I believe, on Sunday. So the coupon's only good for the first couple weeks, but it'll get you 15% off. And you can get that coupon code from the show notes. Or if you go to our Spreadshirt store, there should be a little button at the very top of the page that gives you the coupon code. So if you're going to get something, definitely use that code and save 15%. So I really want to thank Nikki for all the hard work that she did doing the design. She did a fantastic job, and I'm really pleased with how everything came out. And I'm really looking forward to seeing these shirts out in the wild. So if you get something from the store, take a picture and tweet it at me or email it to me, or post it on the Game Master's Journey community over on Google+. I'd love to see it. And hopefully I'm going to be getting some of these myself soon that I can wear for live streams and stuff like that, and just wear for fun. And besides, I need some new clothes anyway. Also want to remind you that I am running and streaming the Hidden Shrine of Tabawakin. You can check that out on my YouTube channel. There's a link to that in the show notes over at starwalkerstudios.com. And we have a lot of fun with that. We play on Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific time, and we live stream that so you can come watch us live. And if you can't make it during that time, no worries. The videos are also up on my YouTube channel, and you can watch them anytime. And finally, I will remind you that I have a D&D adventure for sale called The Trickster's Labyrinth. You can find that at starwalkerstudios.com. And it's my first published D&D adventure. So another great way that you can support what I'm doing is to check out my adventure. And I really appreciate and thank everyone who's purchased it so far. And I'm really looking forward to hearing back from people who've either run or played it, what they thought of it and how it worked out for them. And boy, I am having a hard time getting the words out this morning. But it's a Monday. What are you gonna do? Hopefully we can get this going a little bit better here going forward. I have a couple pieces of feedback that I wanted to share at the top of the show today. First of all, I got a comment on the website from Johnny on a previous episode, and I don't often share just general feedback that I get unless it's a question that I want to discuss on or answer on an episode. But, it occurred to me, I was like, every once in a while, I should just share some feedback that I get. There is so much negativity out there in the world today, especially online, that sometimes you can forget that nice people actually do exist and actually do use the internet. And not everybody's a hater. Not everybody just hates everything in sight. And so it's really nice to get some nice feedback once in a while. And so I thought I would share it with you. So Johnny left a really nice message on the website. He says, "This is the episode that got me hooked. I was not a podcast guy, but someone commented about your podcast over on Reddit, so I downloaded a random app to start listening and to practice both my English and my GM skills. And oh boy, this was a blast. This episode was amazing. Then I went to the first that the app had available, episode 101 with Matthew Colville, and that one was amazing as well. You were a great company this past week. Really great host, great content creator, and your English pronunciation and pace are astonishing. You got yourself a fan and a patron. As a new DM, I salute you, sir." And again, that's from Johnny, and thank you so much for that comment, Johnny. And it occurs to me, you were talking about the episode. I should let people know what episode it was that you were commenting on. So let me pull that up so that I can share that. And let's see. He was commenting on episode 134. So Johnny, I'd love to know, where in the world are you? You mentioned that you're using the show to help practice your English. So I'm assuming you're not in the United States, although you certainly could be. But I'd be very curious to know where in the world you are. It's really amazing how people listen to this show all over the world. And it's very humbling, I guess, that my humble little podcast that I produce here in Bellingham, Washington, is listened all over the place. And that's super cool. So Johnny, if you're listening to this, tweet me or email me or something. Let me know where you are. I'd love to know. Also got a comment on episode 161, Factions and Organizations, by Complacent Badger over on the YouTube channel. And Complacent Badger says, "Great episode. Going through the DMG is an excellent idea." Well, I'm glad you think so, because that's what we're doing today. This DMG was what brought me back to D&D after becoming disillusioned with 3.5/Pathfinder. I have a very similar story, Complacent Badger. It wasn't the DMG that brought me back to D&D after, like you, 3.5/Pathfinder. But it was 5th edition, and I too am very impressed with this DMG, and it's my favorite DMG yet. I love the use of organizations to add depth and angles to quests, but I often find some players attempt to lean too heavily on these groups to their own entertainment detriment. How do you personally deal with this while still making the organization seem helpful? I don't know that I've had this problem myself, or I don't remember having it anyway. And I'm not sure exactly what's happening with you and your group, how they're leaning too heavily on the organizations to their entertainment detriment. So all I can do is take my best guess and let you know how I think I would handle it if I had such a problem come up. So I'm guessing that maybe what's happening is they're members of organizations, and instead of going out and adventuring and having adventures, they're trying to get the organizations or other people in the organizations to do stuff for them. Maybe, I don't know, you're thinking, oh, they're going to go question these NPCs about something that happened, and you're planning to have these role-playing encounters. And instead of doing that, the players just send someone from the organization to do it for them. So kind of assuming it's that kind of thing where instead of doing things that their characters would do or role-playing things that you would normally role-play, they're instead relying on organizations and contacts and people that they know and have access to do these things for them. And you feel like they're missing out on role-playing opportunities or story opportunities because they're basically missing whole scenes because they're having NPCs do stuff for them. So as far as how I would approach that, if I saw that happening, is first thing I would keep in mind is that, an organization doesn't just exist to serve the player characters. And in fact, if anything, the opposite is true. So for everything that the player characters ask for from the organization or expect from the organization, it's fair to assume that the organization is going to expect something from them. It's a two-way street. So one way you can approach it is if you feel like the players are asking too much of the organization or they're relying on it too much, is have the organization start to call in their favors. Presumably they've done a lot for the PCs. They've been utilized and they're doing whatever for the PCs. So now it's the player character's turn to do something for the organization. And you could use this to kick off a whole new quest or a new adventure or even a new campaign, depending on what the organization wants them to do. Another thing to consider is, there's more to the organization than just the player characters. The players tend to think of their characters as the center of the universe. And oftentimes we as GMs tend to think of the player characters as the center of the universe. But in reality, they're not. They're just one group of characters in a very large world filled with many, many characters. And they're not the only adventurers or whatever, presumably in this organization that they're a part of. So, just because they ask an organization to do something for them doesn't mean that the answer is always going to be yes. Maybe the organization is tapped out on resources. Maybe they don't have manpower to help the PCs, or maybe they just have more important things to do. Or maybe the powers that be in the organization, whoever the player characters report to, feel like the players are asking too much from the organization and not contributing enough by comparison, and that they're asking the organization to do things that they should be doing themselves. And again, this kind of goes in with the last thing I was talking about. So it could be a thing where they're like, we're not going to do this thing for you, or we're not going to do this thing for you until you do something for us, or we just don't have the time or the manpower to do this thing for you right now. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons you could come up with why the organization might just say no. And another way you can approach this also is to just have a frank talk with the players out of character. Maybe this is something you can handle that way, where you can say, hey, look, guys, it's cool that you have these organizations and I want you to use them, but I do feel that you're using them for things that aren't appropriate, and maybe explain to them why you don't think it's appropriate, or why you think the way they're using the organization is decreasing the amount of fun that they could be having. And, maybe you can just explain it to them and say, hey, this isn't really what I intended this organization to be used for. At the end of the day, you guys are adventurers and the story's about you. So, if there's something cool to be done or something exciting to be done, your character should be doing it, not, NPCs that you send to do it for you instead. And this kind of thing can also happen if your player characters have followers or hirelings or things like that. You can get into an issue where they're sending their NPCs off to do things that you'd rather the player characters do. So, this can crop up in other ways in the game too. So sometimes the easiest solution is just an out of character one and just tell the players, hey, you guys are kind of missing out if you're sending your followers on adventures instead of going yourselves. So yeah, those are my ideas as far as that. And I did reply to this on YouTube, and I'm wondering now if I remembered everything I said on YouTube. So let's check over on YouTube here and just make sure that I said everything that I said on YouTube. Yeah, that's basically what I said on YouTube. The only other thing is, you could also make what the organization expects from the PCs proportionate to how much they use that organization's resources, right? So the more favors that the PCs are asking from the organization, or the more that they're using that group's resources, the more that organization is going to ask from the PCs. So you could, through that, you could establish a point where the players realize they're getting diminishing returns, right? It's like, wow, we're having the guild or whatever it is that we're part of do all this stuff for us, but now they're expecting even more and more out of us, and we're spending more time doing quests and things for the guild than we are for what we want to do. So, maybe if we stop using their resources so much, maybe they won't ask so much of us in return. So yeah, I think that's a couple different ways that you could handle that. So that's it for the feedback I want to talk about today. I want to thank both of you for your feedback. I really appreciate it. And if you would like to send feedback to me, a great way to do so is to email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. So without further ado, let's move on to our discussion of the Dungeon Master's Guide. All right, so returning to the DMG today, we are still in Chapter 1. We are just taking our time getting through Chapter 1. There's a lot of great material in Chapter 1. So we're in Part 1 of the book, and which is Master of Worlds, and we're in Chapter 1, which is called A World of Your Own. So this is all kinds of world building stuff, and since world building is a big topic that we really focus on this show, it seems appropriate that we're really kind of digging in to Chapter 1 here and talking about world building. So far in this series of episodes, we've talked about the basic big picture ideas for your world, the core assumptions you want to make. We've talked about gods and pantheons in your world and some thoughts on developing and designing those, different types of religious systems. And we've talked about mapping, whether it's mapping the entire world or mapping on a more local scale for the player characters to use, and everything in between. We talked about creating settlements, and we talked about factions and organizations. And last time we talked about magic and using magic to really establish kind of a unique flavor to your world, and thinking how much or how little magic is a part of what's going on in your world. So today we are going to begin a discussion on creating a campaign. And this is actually a fairly lengthy section in this chapter, to the point that I sincerely doubt that we're going to get through all of it in one episode, unless I made a crazy long episode. So if needed, we will divide this in parts. And I think what I will do is release the second part of this discussion later this week for July's bonus episode. So one of the milestones that we recently hit on our Patreon page was that I would produce an extra episode, an extra bonus episode of Game Master's Journey every month. And this is in addition to the regularly scheduled weekly episodes that I produce. So I think this will be a great way to do that this month so that you don't have to wait a whole nother week to hear the next part of this discussion. All right, so let's start out talking about creating a campaign. This is on page 25 in the Dungeon Master's Guide. The world you create is the stage for the adventures you set in it. You don't have to give more thought to it than that. You can run adventures in an episodic format where the characters or with the characters as the only common element, and also weave themes throughout those adventures to build a greater saga of the characters' achievements in the world. Planning an entire campaign might seem like a daunting task, but you don't have to plot out every detail right from the start. And this is a recurring theme in the DMG and also a recurring theme on this show, which is when you're building a world, when you're preparing for an adventure, when you're preparing for a campaign, focus on what you need right now. You know, think of it like triage, right? You're going to handle the most important things first. You're going to save those kind of gravy and icing things that are fun or flavorful, but aren't needed right now. You're going to save those for the end. And instead, you're going to focus your precious time on what you need right now, what's important right now. And I think that's a great way to approach it if your time is limited. If you have limitless time, then who cares, right? Then you don't need to organize, maybe. I don't know. I think we all have limited time to some degree or another, though. You can start with the basics, running a few adventures, and think about larger plot lines you want to explore as the campaign progresses. You're free to add as much or as little detail as you wish. And I think there's another reason this is a good way to approach this is not just saving time and you know, focusing your time on what you need so that you're prepared for the next session that you run, but it also can help you avoid some problems that you might get into otherwise. One of those is world builder's disease, which I've talked about earlier on the show, which is more to do with world building, but where you're just spending like crazy amounts of time developing your setting instead of running games in it. But more to the point of this discussion is you can get into issues if you plan too much ahead in your campaigns, because it could lead to you doing that awful dreaded thing that we often talk about, railroading the players, which is to say that you have such a strict plot planned for your campaign. The player characters are just kind of along for the ride, and the players don't really get to make meaningful decisions. So, you know, that's something that you want to avoid. And an easy way to avoid that is to not plan too far in the future. Don't plan more than a few sessions ahead, because you don't really know where things are going to go anyway. Or another way to approach it is you can plan further ahead, but the further ahead you go in time from where the PCs are right now, just make those plans more and more loose, more like, for instance, an outline than, you know, writing a whole story. Or another way to think about it is you're not fleshing out all the details, right? You're coming up with a few main ideas, a few kind of story beats or plot points that you plan to hit through the campaign, but you're not coming up with a lot of details about them as far as where and when they occur, for instance. And you're also not coming up with all that connective tissue, all the things that lead from scene to scene and adventure to adventure and game session to game session and tie everything together, you know, A to B to C to D and so on. So, for instance, you know, let me just give kind of a generic example. You know, let's say I'm building a campaign and we're going to start at first level, And I'm thinking that I'm going to have this big bad evil guy, Lord Voldemort kind of bad guy. And, you know, in early parts of the campaign, the player characters will mainly just encounter this guy's minions and people working for him and find out that he exists and that he's pulling the strings behind a lot of the bad things that are going on. And then as they get to, say, you know, second tier, like 5th to 10th level, they start to learn about his plans more directly and start more actively working to thwart what he's trying to do. And then, say, third tier, around, you know, 11th, 12th, 13th level, around there, I figure that they'll have like a final showdown with the big bad guy himself. You know, and right there, I've kind of sketched out, if we're planning to play towards, you know, 20th level, I've sketched out the first, you know, 60% of the campaign or something like that. But it's very, you know, it's very loose. Like, I know, you know, I want there to be this bad guy. I want him to encounter his minions. And then as time goes on, they encounter kind of more leaders among his minions so that they can learn more about what this bad guy is up to and what he's trying to accomplish. And eventually they start going after the bad guy himself. And eventually they have some kind of final showdown with the bad guy where they either defeat him or not. So that's all pretty vague, right? Like, I'm not talking about where this is going to happen or how it's going to happen or when it's going to happen. So I have this idea of where I want the campaign to go and kind of what we're heading for, but I haven't worked out exactly how that's going to happen. I haven't worked out how are the player characters going to find out what the bad guy is up to. I mean, I have this idea, well, they'll, you know, question minions and eventually, you know, the average minion isn't going to know much of anything, but eventually, you know, maybe they can capture and question someone more important that might have valuable information. You know, and I might start thinking about who that might be, but, you know, I'm just, it's all up in the air right now. And as far as how they're going to track down the big bad guy and where they're going to fight him and how they're going to fight him and all that, you know, that's all up in the air too. And so the more of that you can leave undefined, the more room you give yourself as the campaign progresses to tailor what's coming immediately next to what's happened so far in the campaign and to the characters and things like that. The start of a campaign resembles the start of an adventure. You want to jump quickly into the action, show the players that adventure awaits, and grab their attention right away. Give the players enough information to make them want to come back week after week to see how the story plays out. And this is another kind of theme that we keep coming back to on the show, whether you're starting just an adventure or you're starting an entire campaign. You know, that first game session and even more the first scene of that first session is really important. You know, if you're familiar with novels, whether writing them or reading them, you see the same thing with a novel. The first chapter of a novel is really important. It's what's going to hook the reader in. The first page of that chapter is really important. You know, that's also going to be that immediate hook to hook the reader in. And also, you know, some people when shopping for a book might, if they're in a bookstore, might flip open the book and read that first page. And so, you know, you want your writing really tight. You want, you know, really good evocative writing and really, you know, a lot of times authors spend more time on that first page than they do on any other page of the book because they really want to, you know, blow your mind with that first page. And even more, a lot of times the first sentence is something that writers will spend quite a bit of time on, crafting the perfect first sentence to really set the tone and get things going and really grab that reader's attention right away. You see the same kind of thing in movies. You know, a good movie is going to grab your interest in the very first scene of that movie. It's not going to make you sit around bored for 20 minutes before you decide that you care about this movie or you care about these characters. So as a GM, you want to use the same kind of techniques, whether you're starting an entire campaign or just an adventure. You want that first adventure to really hook the players. You want them to come back. You want them to be excited for the next week's session when that adventure's over or when that session's over. And you also want the first scene, the opening scene of the adventure, to really hook the players in and be something exciting. It doesn't have to be a combat, although combat is usually an easy win there, but it needs to be something interesting. It needs to be something where there's something at stake, and it needs to be something where the players and their characters have something meaningful that they can do. About the worst way to start a campaign or an adventure or any game session is with exposition, sitting in front of the players with pages of stuff you've typed out that you're now going to read to them to tell them about your world or the city or the political situation or whatever. There's a time and a place for info dumping, as they call it. The very beginning of the first session is not the time or the place. Just give them the bare minimum they need to know what's going on right around them at this moment in time, and then jump into the action as soon as you can and get them doing something, get them making decisions. And just think about it like if you were writing a book or a movie, how would you approach it? How would you craft this story so that it's really going to engage us from the very beginning, and we're going to be eagerly turning those pages from the very beginning. So now we're going to talk about some more specific guidelines and suggestions to think about and how to approach creating a campaign. So this is super useful if you're a new GM and this is your first campaign you're creating, or maybe you're not a new GM, but maybe you've always run published stuff and now you're going to do your own thing. But even for, grognards like me, there's a lot we can learn from this. And there, even if we don't necessarily learn anything, there are some great tools in these pages that we can use when we create our campaigns. So first, start small. When you first start building your campaign, start small. The characters need to know only about the city, town, or village where they start the game, and perhaps the nearby dungeon or location where they're going to find adventure. This is D&D, so we just use dungeon as a generic term, but it doesn't mean it has to be an actual dungeon. It's just a place where they're going to find adventure, a place where they're going to have encounters. And those encounters don't have to be combat encounters. They could be social encounters or exploration encounters. You might decide that the barony is at war with a nearby duchy, or that a distant forest is crawling with ettercaps and giant spiders, and you should note these things. But at the start of the game, the local area is enough to get the campaign off the ground. Follow these steps to create that local area. Number 1, create a home base. See the settlements section earlier in this chapter for guidance on building this settlement. And we discussed the settlements aspect of this, the settlements part of the chapter, in episode, as I look it up here, it wasn't that long ago, 158 of Game Master's Journey, creating settlements for your campaigns. So if you're new to the show, if you're new to this series and you want to learn more about creating settlements and what the DMG has to say about that, go check out episode 158. A small town or village at the edge of the wilderness serves as a fine home base in most D&D campaigns. Use a larger town or city if you want a campaign with urban adventuring. Yeah, and that's a great point. That's a great way to kind of direct the campaign in the kind of direction you want to go in the very beginning. If you're not interested in urban storytelling, if you're not interested in a campaign where the player characters spend a lot of their time in the city doing, politicking and stuff like that, then a great way to avoid that happening, at least at the beginning of the campaign, is don't start out in a big city. Start out in a small town or a village where that kind of thing just really isn't possible. On the other hand, if you do like that kind of thing and you want to encourage that kind of thing, then starting in a larger town or city would be ideal, because then that's a possibility and the player characters don't have to go on a long voyage to get to where they can get involved in politics and the movers and shakers of their world. So after you create a home base, you next, step 2, create a local region. So this is very much the kind of taking the bottom up approach that we discussed when we talked about mapping on the show, which was in episode 156. See mapping the campaign earlier in this chapter for guidance. And again, we discussed that on episode 156 of this show. Draw a map at province scale where 1 hex equals 1 mile with the home base near the center. Fill in the area within a day's travel, about 25 to 30 miles of the home base. Pepper it with 2 to 4 dungeons or similar adventure locales. So if you're using a standard 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper with the province scale grid on it where each hex is equal to a mile, and you put the settlement in the middle of the page, then the entirety of that page covers about where the PCs could go with a day's travel from any direction from that settlement, roughly speaking. Pepper it with 2 to 4 dungeons or similar adventure locales. An area that size is likely to have 1 to 3 additional settlements as well as the home base, so give thought to them as well. So yeah, so you start with your home base, then you start with your starting area. So this is just enough to keep the adventurers busy, for a while, for the first few sessions at least. And then next, step 3, you start crafting your beginning adventure. A single dungeon makes a good first adventure for most campaigns. See Chapter 3, Creating Adventures, for guidance, and we'll discuss Chapter 3 at a later date on this show. A home base provides a common starting location for the characters. This starting point might be the village where they grew up or a city that attracted them from points beyond. Or perhaps they begin the campaign in the dungeons of an evil baron's castle where they've been locked up for various reasons, legitimate or otherwise, throwing them into the midst of the adventure. For each of these steps, give the locations only as much detail as they need. You don't need to identify every building in a village or label every street in a large city. If the characters start in the Baron's dungeon, you'll need the details of this first adventure site, but you don't have to name all the Baron's knights. Sketch out a simple map, think about the surrounding area, and consider whom the characters are most likely to interact with early in the campaign. Most important, visualize how this area fits into the theme and story you have in mind for your campaign. Then start working on your first adventure. So yeah, this is, really great advice here and foods for thought. And just a couple things that I'll add for this is, another part of your consideration of where to start your adventure as far as, a larger city versus a smaller settlement like a village or a town, is think about how much diversity you want there to be available for the players when they create their characters. I'm thinking specifically about player character race. However, their backgrounds can come into play to this to some degree as well. And what I'm talking about here is, let's say you decide to start your adventure in a tiny little village out in the middle of nowhere somewhere, and it's a human village, and you decide, this is a human village. There's so many people that live here. They're all humans. Maybe there's like one halfling family that lives in the village, but other than that, they're all humans, right? So you have the players start creating characters, and as long as they make human characters, no problem. They can be people who grew up in the village. And if you want to have a kind of the eye of the world like story where it starts out with very simple characters that are farmers and other types of people that live in this little backwater village, and they're going to go see the world and find adventure, then that'll work great for you. But then, you could have issues if you have player characters that want to play different races. And, let's say you got 4 players. If you got one player that wants to play a dwarf or an elf or something like that, like it might not be that big of a deal. You might say, okay, well, you were traveling and stopped by this village for some reason. But what if all the players want to play non-humans, or most of them do? So you're going to have this tiny little village full of humans and this group of adventurers where none of them are human and none of them are from the village. So, that doesn't mean you can't do that, but it's just things that you want to think about. On the flip side, if you set your story in a city, those kinds of things are much less of an issue, because oftentimes cities will have much more diverse populations than smaller settlements will. And even if they don't, or even if that particular race wouldn't be in the city, like the dwarf character just wouldn't live in the city, it makes much more sense that someone from somewhere elsewhere would travel to a city than a tiny little village, right? So there's a lot of reasons why that dwarf character might have come to this particular city. So I've just found that cities work a lot better when you have players that are going to want to play a very diverse group. And I've found that most D&D groups, pretty much, I think every D&D group I've run for has been pretty diverse, where people are playing different races and very different character concepts. And so, it's something you want to think about. And if you are going to start in this tiny little village where there's only humans, you definitely want to tell your players that before they start thinking about character concepts, so that they can have that in mind. So that's the reason in my world of Primordia, I started working right away on the city of Elandria, because I wanted, for the most part, when I ran games in the setting, I wanted players to have all of the available options for classes and races and backgrounds available to them. And I thought the easiest way to do that would be to have a large city that's very cosmopolitan and trades with a bunch of places. So that way, no matter what character a player comes up with, it makes sense that they're there in the city, and we don't have to work too hard coming up with a plausible reason why that character is there. And as far as, not having to name all the NPCs wherever you start out, a great trick that a lot of GMs use, and I'm sure this is recommended somewhere in the DMG or the player's handbook, is to generate a list of names for your setting, whatever you're using or whatever game you're playing. And ideally, you probably want to generate 3 lists of names. You want a list of male first names, female first names, and then last names. And then that way, anytime the player characters interact with an NPC that you haven't fleshed out, or you didn't think they'd interact with, or you just came up with on the fly, and they ask, what's this character's name? You can just go to your list, you can grab one of those names, and there you go. And I use this myself, and I will usually make a mark. I don't cross out the name, because more than one person can have the same name in the world, but I make a mark beside a name when I use it. So that way, when I look at my list, I have an idea of how many times I've used that name. And I will usually try not to reuse names unless I have to, just because it helps the players keep NPCs straight if you're not reusing the same names again and again. So that's a really easy trick to help you out. And then that way, if you need to name a character, you can do it on the fly during play, and you don't need to spend your prep time naming every single NPC that exists. Now, if it's an NPC that you're planning to be important in the story, or one that you think the player characters are probably going to interact with quite a bit, then you might want to actually come up with a name ahead of time, but it's up to you. All right, so let's continue on. What is next? Set the stage. As you start to develop your campaign, you'll need to fill in the players on the basics. For easy distribution, compile essential information into a campaign handout. Such a handout typically includes the following material: any restrictions or new options for character creation, such as new or prohibited races. Any information in the backstory of your campaign that the characters would know about. If you have a theme or direction in mind for the campaign, this information could include seeds hinting at that focus. Basic information about the area where the characters are starting, such as the name of the town, important locations in and around it, prominent NPCs they'd know about, and perhaps rumors that point to trouble that's brewing. Keep the handout short and to the point. And I think that's a very important thing here. So I'll say it again. Keep the handout short and to the point. Think about it this way. The longer the handout is, the less likely your players will read it, and the less likely your players will read all of it, and the less likely your players will remember any given part of it. So really focus on what's important. So if you're going to tell the players about the setting, don't give them 1,000 years of history. Don't give them your settings creation myth, unless it's somehow relevant. Only focus on information that their characters would know and information that is going to be important and relevant in that first session. So, you're going to focus a little bit on the area where they're at, maybe some NPCs that they interact with in that area, and just really focus on what do they need to know right now so that we can start playing. Your kind of frame of mind that you should be keeping at all times is, I don't want to spend any more time info dumping world setting information, whether that's during the game, just going on and on about stuff, or whether that's in the handouts that I give out. I don't want to spend any more time doing that than I absolutely have to, because we want to get to playing the game. That's the part that's fun. That's what the players are looking forward to, is playing the game, not listening to you drone on about your setting and 30,000 years of history. Now, if you have players who want more information, then by all means, give them all that they want that you're willing and comfortable giving them. I would still recommend focusing on information that their characters would know. I wouldn't give them a bunch of stuff their characters don't know, because then what's the point of exploring your world if you're just going to tell them everything, right? Part of the point of playing D&D for a lot of us is to explore the setting, whether it's, especially I would say if it's a homebrew setting, because, if you're running in Forgotten Realms, like I can find out all about Forgotten Realms by going to a wiki or whatever. I don't have to play the game to learn about Forgotten Realms. But if you're running in your own setting, then the only way I can really learn about your setting is to play the game and play my character and explore different places. And that's a big motivation to go to the next place or to do the next thing. So don't neuter that by giving your players a bunch of information that they haven't, quote, earned yet, that their characters haven't learned about yet. But if you have players that are willing to read through stuff that you write on your world, feel free to give them loads of information on their hometown and their character's race and culture and things that player character would know about. Like, give them all that they can handle. But as a general rule, when you're starting out, short and sweet is always better. Even if you have a burst of creative energy that produces 20 pages of great background material, save it for your adventures. Let the players uncover the details gradually in play. Yeah, I completely agree. And again, here they're recommending 2 pages as a reasonable maximum for this player handout. So, it's gonna vary based on what you're doing. I'm right now working on a player's guide for my next campaign in Primordia, which I've talked about on the show. And that thing's pushing 30 pages. But so you're like, whoa, Lex, you just totally violated your own guidelines that you're talking about. But this is not really a player handout in the sense of I'm going to give this to the players and expect them to read it and know it for the first session. The player's guide that I'm making for Primordia is a reference. It's not intended to be read cover to cover. It's intended to be used as a reference book, and also is something that I intend to use for all of my campaigns in Primordia going forward. So I'm putting more effort into it in the beginning so that every time I do a campaign, I can just give the players this document. I don't have to make a new handout every time. And it also has, a lot of, like I said, reference information. So I have all the races in there. So a lot of the racers are races from the player's handbook, so I'll just have information about, well, how are wood elves of Primordia different than wood elves in the player's handbook and stuff like that. So if I'm a player and I'm playing a wood elf ranger, then I might want to read the section on the wood elves, and I might want to read the section on ranger because I have a little discussion about each of the classes in that's more specific to the actual campaign I'm going to run, but kind of how that class would work in that campaign. So as a player, I'd read the ranger part, I'd read the wood elf part, but I don't need to read about all the races, right? Now I could, and I tried to keep the race entries short. So, and again, I'm just talking about things that are different in my world, and otherwise they're like they are in the player's handbook. Because as a player in Primordia, I'm playing a wood elf, so I really want to know about wood elves, but I might want to know a little bit about some of the other races too, just to know kind of common knowledge about those races. So I could kind of skim those other race sections if I wanted to. I then have a whole section on backgrounds, and I talk about which backgrounds from the PHB and the SCAG I use, which ones I don't, which ones I've changed, and then I have some additional ones that I've created myself for Primordia. So again, if I'm a player making a character, I don't need to read all the backgrounds that are from the player's handbook and the SCAG because I already know what those are. I only need to read the few new ones, check to see if any of the ones I'm interested in are changed in any way, and that's it. So, as far as material that the players I want them to read before the beginning of the campaign, I'll try to keep that to about 2 pages or less. But, the entire thing's bigger. But, it's just like the player's handbook. You don't need to read the entire player's handbook to play a character in D&D, right? You just need to read the basic rules and your class and your race and your feats and your spells, and you're good to go. You don't need to read the whole book. So same kind of thing. And again, if you have, like the book says here, if you have a burst of creativity and you start just having all these ideas, and this happens a lot when you start, writing a player handout or something, maybe you're writing up something about the city to give to the players the first session that they enter the city. As you're writing this thing, you keep coming up with more ideas and you're just writing down everything that you come up with, and you end up with this huge thing. And that's awesome. And like this says, you definitely want to note that. You definitely want to keep that for yourself, for your notes. But then you want to take that and kind of condense it down to what's really relevant to the players and what do the players need right now. You don't want to bombard them with all of that all at once.
This is Mike Shalai, and you're listening to Game Master's Journey.
I want to take a minute to give a quick shout out to the patrons of Starwalker Studios. The support of the patrons makes this show possible. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd love to give a little bit back, becoming a patron is a great way to do so. It's because of the patrons that all of the listeners of Game Master's Journey enjoy a bonus episode every month, as well as the Game Master's Journey live stream. I'd also like to give a huge shout out and a thank you to my Tier 5 patron, Mr. Steve Strickland. Let's hear it for Steve. Yeah.
Yes.
The man. Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you to all the patrons. You can find out more about becoming a patron by clicking on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. All right, so returning to our discussion of the DMG, we are talking about creating a campaign. So we've set the stage for the campaign. Next, we want to involve the characters. Once you've identified what your campaign is about, let the players help tell the story by deciding how their characters are involved. This is their opportunity to tie their character's history and background to the campaign, and a chance for you to determine how the various elements of each character's background tie into the campaign story. For example, What secret has the hermit character learned? What is the status of the noble character's family? What is the folk hero's destiny? Some players might have trouble coming up with ideas. Not everyone is equally inventive. You can help spur their creativity with a few questions about their characters. So these are great. These are just some questions that you can ask players during or after character creation to kind of help spark their imaginations and help them flesh out their characters a little bit. Are you a native born and raised in the area? If so, who's your family? What's your current occupation? Are you a recent arrival? Where did you come from? Why did you come to this area? Are you tied to any of the organizations or people involved in the events that kick off the campaign? Are they friends or enemies? Listen to the player's ideas and say yes if you can. Even if you want all the characters to have grown up in the starting town, consider allowing a recent arrival or a transplant if the player's story is convincing enough. Suggest alterations to a character's story so it better fits your world, or weave the first threads of your campaign into that story. So yeah, that's a really great way to approach it. And, like it said, whenever possible, say yes to these ideas that the players come up with and figure out a way to make them work. This is also a great reason to give your players as much information as you can about what you're planning for the campaign before they even start thinking about character concepts. You can kind of head off a lot of those maybe things that you would be tempted to say no to at the pass by letting the players know ahead of time kind of what you're looking for. So if you want all the players to be from this town, then you can tell them that, and then they can hopefully more likely come up with character concepts that would fit a character that grew up in that town. Next, we have some discussion on creating a background. Backgrounds are designed to root player characters in the world, and creating new backgrounds is a great way to introduce players to the special features of your world. Backgrounds that have ties to particular cultures, organizations, and historical events from your campaign are particularly strong. Perhaps the priests of a certain religion live as beggars supported by a pious populace, singing the tales of their deity's exploits to entertain and enlighten the faithful. You could create a mendicant, I'm not sure how you say that, mendicant priest background, or modify the acolyte background to reflect these qualities. It could include musical instrument proficiency, and its feature probably involves receiving hospitality from the faithful. Guidelines for creating a new background are provided in Chapter 9, the Dungeon Master's Workshop. And we will someday get to talking about that when we get to Chapter 9. At the rate we're going, it's going to be a while. I definitely highly encourage you to come up with backgrounds. Even if you're using a published campaign setting, you can still come up with some new backgrounds that more closely tie into the particular story that you want to tell. And if you're using your own campaign setting, then backgrounds are going to be even more useful because you can use them as a way to really highlight some of the things that are different in your setting and some of the things that maybe are possible in your setting that wouldn't be in others. So I have been working on some backgrounds for my next adventure that I want to run. And I just the other day shared these on the Game Master's Journey community because I was hoping for some ideas from you all about maybe some other backgrounds I could come up with for Primordia that I didn't think about. So what I did is I started out with the Player's Handbook and the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, and I went through all the backgrounds in those books and decided whether or not they would fit in the campaign. Most of them did. There were two backgrounds from the Player's Handbook that I decided most likely wouldn't fit. Those were the criminal and the charlatan backgrounds. And that's mainly because for this particular campaign I'm going to run, I want the players to play heroic characters. So those backgrounds don't lead to heroic characters. So I don't know that they'd work really well with this campaign, with the possible exception of a player who wanted to roleplay a redemption arc, wanted to almost do a Han Solo kind of thing where they start out as some roguish, not reputable character, maybe selfish and whatnot. And through the story, they change and grow as a person. So something like that might work. So I went through that, found ones that didn't work. There's one in the Skag that just wouldn't work, the Uthgard tribe member, just because there aren't any barbarians in this area of Primordia. So I don't see that really being relevant to the campaign. The rest of them worked fine. A couple of them I modified slightly to fit Primordia better, especially some of the ones from the Sword Coast guide. But other than that, I was able to say, most of these backgrounds are fine. You can use them. There were some that had some considerations. For instance, the Outlander background had some considerations because, it's a little more difficult with that because Primordia isn't right now a world where many people could survive out on their own. Certainly not any starting character level people wouldn't be able to make it on their own. So the Outlander, as far as the hermit living in the wilderness, doesn't really work for this campaign. However, one of the thoughts given in the discussion of the Outlander background is that you could be an Outlander who's a like a cloistered scholar kind of person, where you were in a temple or something like that, where you didn't have a lot of contact with other people. You were kind of by yourself a lot and didn't have a lot of social contact. So someone who wanted to go that angle with it could make it work. So once I'd done that, then I started trying to think of what are concepts that I could think of for characters in Primordia and Elandria specifically. What are backgrounds that would fit those concepts that aren't backgrounds that are part of this list that we have here, and trying to kind of fill in those holes. And I've found that creating backgrounds is actually pretty easy. Really for me, the hardest part is coming up with the character traits, like for Bond's ideals and flaws. It's not like super hard, but it takes some time to come up with those. But figuring out the mechanics part of a background is usually really easy. And in a nutshell, a background will usually give you proficiency in 2 skills, and then you will get 2 other proficiencies that you divide up between a selection of tool proficiencies or languages. So it could be like thieves' tools or smithing tools, or it could be something like an herbalism kit or land vehicles or water vehicles, which would be ships basically, or languages. So you get 2 skills from a background, and then you get 2 either languages or 2 tool proficiencies, or one of each usually. And then you get some kind of special feature, which is some special thing that the background lets you do. And then you get some equipment, and that's pretty much it as far as the mechanics of a background. So that's usually pretty easy to come up with. It's some of the more role-playing stuff that takes a little more thought to come up with. So what's been challenging is trying to think of character concepts that people might want to play, and what would be a good background for that, and does that background exist, and if not, create it. And specifically trying to think of backgrounds that really show the flavor of Primordia and Elandria, and allow you to make a character that's unique compared to what you might play in another world. So some of the backgrounds that I'm working on right now are the adventurer. So in my world of Primordia, adventurer is an actual profession that is, that's a word people use in the setting. People will talk about someone being an adventurer, and I have a guild of adventurers. So being an adventurer is just as bona fide a thing as being a cobbler or being a farmer in Primordia. So I thought it would be appropriate to have an adventurer background. I have another background that is the alchemist / herbalist. And I haven't decided whether to call it alchemist or herbalist, or to make two separate backgrounds, one for each, or what I'm going to do with that. Kind of my thoughts behind that background are like kind of like an apothecary, or like if you're familiar with Wheel Time, like a wisdom or a wise woman, or every country in that setting had a different term for it. But someone who heals people but doesn't use magic, instead uses herbs and things like that, kind of like your village healer or whatever, but non-magical. So I've got that. I've got the cartographer background. I think that would be a pretty big deal, especially in the guild. There's got to be someone in every adventuring team that can make maps, because part of what they're doing is they're exploring and mapping the wilds, and especially since the breaking of the world, not everything's the same as it used to be. So, they don't necessarily know where everything is anymore. So they need new maps made. So I think cartographer is a pretty appropriate background. I came up with a background farmer, because one thing I want to do more of in Primordia and Elandria that I don't see enough done with, in my opinion, in the core D&D game, is I want to do more with social class. So, we have some backgrounds that reflect social class. Like we have the noble background that reflects, that you're a noble. We have the guild artisan / guild merchant background, which would represent kind of the middle class. And then we don't really have like a peasant background, but there's numerous backgrounds that would go along with like lower class or working class, like the soldier all the way down to the urchin. And, there's probably a lot of backgrounds that would fit that class, less so of the merchant class and the noble class. And, other than taking those backgrounds and having that somewhat determine how much gold you start out with, and other than your cost of living, which is completely, what's the word? Like you choose what your cost of living is, right? It's just however much you want to pay. Other than that, there's not really any acknowledgement of the existence of social classes in the game, and the idea that you're born into a certain class and it's relatively difficult to move up from that, and how is that reflected in your character? So, like I said, we have a couple backgrounds that work well for like a higher class character. We have the noble background, and then we have in the Skag, we have the Waterdavian noble background, which I reconfigured to the Elandrian noble background. Maybe I could come up with a background for someone who's actually royal, but I don't know if it would. I don't know. I guess that's the kind of thing I would come up with if I needed. Like if I had a player that really wanted to play someone who was a member of the royal family, then maybe I'd come up with a background for that. But if a player really wanted to play that, I'd let him play it. But it's not a character concept I would like put out there myself, because in most cases that kind of person wouldn't become an adventurer. But, player characters are by definition exceptions to the rules, right? So a player could definitely play that, but I don't know if I'm going to like just come up with a background for that, but I guess it could. So, and then I came up with my own version of the merchant background. So if you look at the guild artisan background, there's a variant guild merchant. But I came up with a merchant background that you can use in place of that if you want to be a guild merchant, or that you could also use if you want to be a merchant who isn't part of a guild, who's more kind of just a merchant out on his own, doing his own thing. And then, so I came up with a farmer because I wanted like the low class kind of peasant class background for someone that wanted to play a character from that background. And I felt like farmer was a big one that was missing. I'm like, lots of people are farmers in these settings, and someone could grow up on a farm and grow up a farmer and later become an adventurer. And that was a pretty easy background to come up with. Another one I was trying to work on was a servant background. Like I was picturing someone who was a servant in like a royal palace or something like that, or possibly even like someone that just waited tables at an inn or something like that, and trying to come up with a background that represented that. The problem with that was I couldn't come up with 2 skills that such a person would have. I had the idea of giving them insight, which even that is kind of a stretch, but a lot of the backgrounds get insight. And it's like, well, I guess a servant, you have to be good at reading people and knowing, whether they want their cup filled or not, or whether they want to be bothered by you right now or not. So I could see insight. Like, you could definitely argue it. But other than that, I didn't really see a skill that I thought servants would have. So that was kind of the end of that, because I kind of needed new skills, and I kicked around the idea of, well, maybe instead of a second skill, I could give them an extra tool, because I wouldn't see servants knowing a bunch of languages. But even the tools, it's like, I could see a servant having maybe 1 tool proficiency, but I don't know about 2, and definitely not 3. Like, they'd know how to do what they do, but that's it. They wouldn't be servants that, like, I could do 3 different things. I can take care of horses, or I can cook your dinner, or I don't know, I can hunt for you or something. I don't know. So yeah, it turned out servant was just not a great idea for an adventurer. If I made a background that really made sense for servant, it would be really underpowered compared to other backgrounds, because it would only have 1 skill, maybe 1 tool, and that's it. And by definition, wouldn't start out with a lot of money. So, from a game balance point of view, it would be kind of a mistake to take that background, and I don't see players wanting to take it. So it's like, why design something that people aren't going to use? So I kind of had to shelve the servant. But maybe as I develop my social classes more for Elandria, and I think more about what it's going to be like to be members of those different classes, I might come up with some more ideas for backgrounds representing people of different classes, which I think would be really cool. And then my final background I've been working on is Rift Hunter. And this is another great background for an adventurer. And this is someone who's actually going out and looking for rifts and helping to seal them. I don't know that this really worked great as a background, just because that would be something you would do as an adventurer, as a member of the guild. And the idea of a background is this is your life up to that point. But I like the concept of it. And I was thinking maybe this could be someone who is like 2nd generation guild member. Like, their parents were members of the guild, so they were kind of raised even as a child as an adventurer, and maybe even went on adventures with their parents before they came of age or something like that. So I could see something like that working. I don't know, but those are the ones I came up with. So if you have any ideas of other backgrounds that I could develop for Primordia, definitely let me know. GameMastersJourney@gmail.com. So yeah, I racked my brain, and I've come up with 6 of them, 6 new ones, which is a respectable number. I think I could probably come up with a few more. And, the mechanics are basically done for them. I just have to come up with the bonds and merits and flaws for all of them, and what their little special ability thing is, and stuff like that. But when it comes to creating new things for the game, backgrounds are one of the easier things that you can create. So the next section in the DMG is campaign events. And this is a lengthy section, and we're going to skip it for now. And we're going to come back to this in episode 165 and part 2 of our discussion on creating campaigns. But for now, we are going to skip ahead to page 32 and talk about tracking time in your campaign. And this can be an important thing to think about. A calendar lets you record the passage of time in the campaign. More importantly, it lets you plan ahead for the critical events that shake up the world. For simple time tracking, use a calendar for the current year in the real world. Pick a date to indicate the start of the campaign, and make note of the days that adventurers spend on their travels and various activities. The calendar tells you when the seasons change and the lunar cycle. Well, a good one will, anyway, at least as far as the lunar cycle. More importantly, you can use your calendar to track important festivals and holidays, as well as key events that shape your campaign. This method is a good starting point, but the calendar of your world need not follow a modern calendar. If you want to customize your calendar with details unique to your world, consider these types of features. The basics. A fantasy world calendar doesn't have to mirror the modern one, but it can. Do the weeks of a month have names? What about specific days of each month, like the Ides, Nones, and Calends of the Roman calendar? And here it references you to the calendar of Harptos, which is the calendar they use in Forgotten Realms, and they have it here. And you know what? I'm just going to digress here from the DMG and disagree with what this is saying. If you want to come up with your own calendar for your world and come up with your own names for the months and the days and even the years like Forgotten Realms does, you're welcome to do that. But let me give you some food for thought here. First of all, that's going to take time, right? Coming up with, how the calendar works, what you're going to name the months, what you're going to name the years, what you're going to name the days is going to take time. It's going to take creative energy. And you got to wonder, could that time be better spent on something perhaps more interesting, something that your players will perhaps actually care about, something that might actually be relevant to the players and might lead to a fun game session. For instance, working on a new adventure instead of coming up with a new calendar. So that's thought one. Thought two is such a calendar will often, if not always, end up being a pain in the GM's butt. Pain in the butt. And the reason is that now you have to remember, okay, in my world, January is Beast Month. And every time I'm thinking about dates or how long something was or when something occurs, I have to translate in my mind from the real world month to the game world month. It's even worse if you rename the days of the week. It's like, oh no, it's not Friday, it's feast day. So now every time I got to remember that feast day is Friday. And yeah, that can be a huge pain in your butt. You got so many things to think about as a GM when you're running the game, to have to do mental gymnastics to figure out what day of the week it is or what month of the year it is just processing power that could probably be better spent on other things. And the third thought is, not only as much as this will be a pain for you, it's going to be even bigger pain for your players, because they're going to have to remember what the days of the week are, what the months of the year are, and they're going to be even less inclined to remember those than you are because you came up with them. And they're also going to probably be less motivated to remember them than you are. And what's probably going to happen is they're not going to remember them, at least not for a long time. And you're going to have to constantly answer questions like, what day is that? Or what day is Saturday again? Or what month are we? And what's that the equivalent to? And so basically all these boil down to, it wastes a bunch of your time. It wastes a bunch of the players' time, and it creates a lot of confusion for everyone. So why the hell do it? Well, for immersion, for flavor, right? But at the end of the day, as a GM, you always have to choose your battles. You always have to decide what's the most important way to manage my time. What's the most important way, or what's the best way to present my world to the players? And, although it might seem cool to come up with your own months and days and years and all that stuff, and you might feel like, now you've gone to the next level and you have all these bragging rights, at the end of the day, if it doesn't improve gameplay, who cares, right? And if it makes gameplay worse or slows gameplay down or adds to the player's confusion, that's usually not a good thing. That's usually not something we're trying to do. So my recommendation for you is, don't bother with it. Just use January, February, March, April, or whatever months your language uses, or your calendar that you uses. Use the regular days of the week. Who cares? And you know what? I'll give you a great example of why it's not worth caring about this. Something that comes up far more often, at least in games that I run and play in, and games that I watch on YouTube and listen to actual plays for, what comes up far more often in these games than the calendar and what day is it, or what month is it, or what year is it, comes up even more often is the time. Now you think about it, in these worlds, most people don't have access to clocks. Okay. So if you're talking a village, or you're talking a farmer out on a farm somewhere, or someone out in the wilderness, their time probably consists of dawn, morning, noon, afternoon, evening, dusk, and night, right? That's about as precise as they can get, right? And yet, how many times do you hear player characters talk about, we're going to do this in 5 minutes, or we're going to do this in an hour, or they ask the GM what time it is, and he says it's 6:30 p.m., right? So that doesn't make any sense in world. Even people that have access to better time, like for instance, in the city, they might ring bells on the hour. So you might know within an hour what time it is, but you don't know the minute. You might know it's between 6 and 7 p.m., but you don't know it's 6:30. You certainly don't know that this thing you did just took you 5 minutes or 1 minute or 30 seconds. But we hear players reference these things all the time, even though they don't make sense in world. Why? Because that's the way we think of time. We think of minutes and seconds and hours because we're used to always knowing what time it is. In most D&D worlds, only the very rich even have access to a clock. And even then, it's not with them all the time. It's in some room in their mansion somewhere. It's not like every room has a clock, So having conversations where people talk about time more specifically than, we'll meet at third bell or we'll meet at dawn doesn't really fit the setting, right? And yet usually these things happen in game all the time, and we don't even blink. We don't even notice it when we're talking about, oh, we'll meet back up in an hour, or if I don't come back in 10 minutes, go looking for me, or you have a meeting with the merchant tomorrow at 8:30 a.m., right? These happen all the times in our games, and we don't blink. We don't think about it twice. So why get obsessed about the calendar? Why not make it as convenient for you and your players as time is, and just use what we're all used to and get on with it? The other nice thing about using the real calendar, and this still works if you rename it things, so you could take like right now it's 2017. You could take 2017's calendar and use that and say, okay, when we start the campaign, it's the same day in this world as it is here. And then I'll track time from there on out. That's usually what I do is, if we start the game and players are like, what season is it? And it's summer for us right now. I say it's summer. I usually don't worry about like months and days and stuff like that. I just worry about what season is it so I can describe it appropriately. And I usually start out the campaign, it's whatever season we're in the real world. And then from there on, I keep track of the passage of time, because time in the campaign world is going to go much more slowly usually than it does in the real world. So anyway, you have your real calendar. Let's say, it's July 17th and you started playing. So, you look at your calendar and you're like, here's where we are. But I don't call it July. I call it month Inferno. And this isn't 2017. This is the year of the Phoenix. And it's not a Tuesday. It's laundry day. I don't know. Right. So even if you're changing the names, you're still using this calendar as a basis. And then like this suggests, you could use that to know what phase is the moon right now. And I think you can even go beyond that and use it for inspiration for holidays and stuff. So for instance, here in the United States, we just had the 4th of July a couple weeks ago, which is a holiday for us. So if I was playing in my game world and in the game world, it's July 4th. Well, obviously it's not going to be Independence Day, but it could be a holiday. I could say, well, since this is a holiday for me in the real world, I'm going to make this a holiday in Primordia and figure out what that holiday is. Or maybe I want to be really on the nose with it. And I'll say, oh, this is the day that Alondria won its independence from some other nation it used to be part of, or something like that. So, you can do that. And it especially works well with the more pagan holidays and the holidays that are based on pagan holidays, because those tend to correspond with things like solstices and equinoxes, sometimes with different full moons and things like that. And so those kinds of holidays work especially well because you can say, well, in my world, this is also a solstice holiday, and you can even make the holiday, similar. So that's a great way to get some inspiration and to add some flavor to your game. And it can really add some immersion if the PCs enter a new town or whatever, and they're having a festival, and it's because, it's your world's equivalent to Halloween, or a harvest festival. And, you've determined this because you know what day it is in your world, and you looked at the calendar and you're like, oh, it's October 31st. And in this world, that's Halloween. So I'm going to say that this town that the PCs are entering are celebrating a festival or something. And you could use Halloween as inspiration for that, for what that festival is like. Or you could do something totally different, but you still got the idea to have it be a holiday from the calendar that you're using. And if you're going to do that, one way you can throw the PCs off, or the players off, I should say, if you're concerned that they're going to figure out what you're doing with the calendar, or they don't know A, how they ever could, or why they ever could, or B, why anyone would care. But if you really care about it, you could use an old calendar from another year, and you can easily do this online. You can print a calendar from any year that you want, and just make it a year other than the current year, and then it'll throw them off a little bit. So next, you can think about physical cycles. Determine when the seasons fall, marked by the solstices and equinoxes. Do the months correspond to the phases of the moon or moons? Do strange and magical effects occur at the same time as these phenomena? So, I kind of poo-pooed the whole designing your own calendar and especially coming up with a completely different calendar, with different weeks and months, as far as how many days there are and how many days in the year and all that stuff. I mean, God, what a nightmare. Why would you do that to yourself? But even just, changing the names and stuff, I kind of poo-pooed it. But this kind of stuff, thinking about, when are the solstices and equinoxes? How are they celebrated? When are fields planted? When are they harvested? How are those celebrated? Do the months correspond with phases of the moon? Are there certain full moons of the year that are considered especially important? Things like that kind of stuff I do encourage you to think about, because it can really help you flesh out your world. And as you explore those questions and you come up with answers, it can really give your world its own unique flavor. And then, of course, there are religious observances. Sprinkle holy days throughout your calendar. Each significant deity in your world should have at least one holy day during the year, and some gods' holy days correspond to celestial phenomena such as new moons or equinoxes. Holy days reflect the portfolio of a deity. A god of agriculture is honored in the harvest season, or significant events in the history of the deity's worship, such as the birth or death of a holy person, the date of a god's manifestation, the accession of the current high priest, and so on. Certain holy days are civic events observed by every citizen of a town where a god's temple can be found. Harvest festivals are often celebrations on a grand scale. Other holy days are important only to people particularly devoted to a single deity. Still others are observed by priests who perform private rites and sacrifices inside their temples on certain days or specific times of day. And some holy days are local, observed only by the faithful of a specific temple. Give some thought to how priests and common folk celebrate holy days. Going into a temple, sitting in a pew, and listening to a sermon is a mode of worship foreign to most fantasy religions. More commonly, celebrants offer sacrifices to their gods. The faithful bring animals to the temple to be slaughtered or burn incense as an offering. The wealthiest citizens bring the largest animals to flaunt their wealth and demonstrate their piety. People pour out libations at the graves of their ancestors. They spend all-night vigils in darkened shrines or enjoy splendid feasts celebrating a god's bounty. And there are just loads and loads of real-world resources from all kinds of real-world religions that you can use for inspiration on how people might celebrate different holy days. There are also civic observances. Holy days provide the majority of the special celebrations in most calendars, but local or national festivals account for many others. The birthday of a monarch, the anniversary of a great victory in a war, craft festivals, market days, and similar events all provide excuses for local celebrations. And again, you can use your real-world calendar to help you decide when these occur. Just whenever a real holiday occurs, come up with a fantasy equivalent, or maybe not equivalent. You might want to do equivalent for the solstices and things like that are based on natural events. But the civic holidays, you might want to come up with something completely different, but maybe still keep it a civic holiday. And finally, fantastic events. Since your setting is a fantasy world and not a mundane medieval society, add in a few events of an obviously magical nature. For example, perhaps a ghostly castle appears on a certain hill on the winter solstice every year, or every third full moon fills lycanthropes with a particularly strong bloodlust. Also, the 13th night of every month could mark the ghostly wanderings of a long-forgotten nomadic tribe. Extraordinary events such as the approach of a comet or a lunar eclipse make good adventure elements, and you can drop them in your calendar wherever you want. Your calendar can tell you when there's a full moon for a lunar eclipse, but you can always fudge the date for a particular event. So there you go. There are some thoughts on how to use a calendar in your world and how to kind of use it for inspiration, not just for flavor, but for actual adventures. Sometimes these festivals could springboard into an adventure that the player characters can have. And also some thoughts on using or not using a real world calendar as a basis for your game, and whether or not you want to mess with renaming everything on the calendar, and thinking about what are the consequences of that. It'd be a shame to go through all the time and effort to come up with your own days of the week and months of the year, and then you find that it's a total drag and pain in the ass to deal with, and you end up wishing you'd never done it. But now you're kind of committed because you poured so much time into it. Now you're a victim of sunk cost, and you feel like you're stuck with it. So we are going to wrap up our discussion there today. Like I said, there is more in this chapter, and we'll discuss that in the next episode, in our bonus episode for July. And we're going to go into campaign events, which are big events that happen that can take the campaign in a new direction and kickstart an adventure and serve as kind of like signposts through the campaign. So we'll talk about that later this week. Well, that is going to wrap it up for episode 164 of Game Master's Journey. If you'd like to get a hold of me, please visit the website, starwalkerstudios.com, where you can email me, find my Twitter, Google+, Facebook, Pinterest, and YouTube information, and the Game Master's Journey voicemail number, where you can call and leave me a message. If your question or feedback is entertaining or enlightening or both, you may even hear your message on the show. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future topics, I would love to hear from you. You can also find a link to the Game Master's Journey community, where you can share ideas with other listener GMs. Finally, you can learn about how you can support the show by becoming a patron, by making a one-time donation, by using my Amazon referral link when you shop on Amazon, or by purchasing my D&D adventure, The Trickster's Labyrinth. You can find all this and more at starwalkerstudios.com. I hope you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.